Hi, my name is Will, and today we're going to talk about UBI and AI, especially focusing on the UBI part. A lot of people are talking about UBI right now, especially with the rise of AI and concerns about technological unemployment. Today we're going to talk about what UBI is, how much would it cost, how to pay for it, and if and when it is likely to happen. Let's just go ahead and get started. First up, what is UBI? UBI is a universal cash program. The idea is that every citizen of a country gets a fixed amount of money just simply by being a citizen of the country. There is no common agreement on the amount, and that makes talks about UBI a little tricky because you have wildly different versions of UBI that people talk about. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to use two different levels. One of those is what I'm going to call USI, or Universal Supplementary Income. And I'm going to benchmark that at about $500 a month per person. It's a round number, and part of the inspiration for that was based off of some of the emergency fund data that the Fed released. That sort of speaks to the level of economic duress that exists, and a USI, or $500 a month program, is a way to address that. The other level of UBI, which I would call a full UBI, or sort of this more standard definition, is hooked into poverty rates. If we look up the poverty guidelines right now, that works out to about $1,200 per month per person. And that's a perfectly good kind of upper bounds for talking about UBI right now. Anything over that full UBI $1,200 a month range is getting into where now you're actually talking actively replacing full-blown incomes with we're just going to pay people regardless. And that's actually kind of what a lot of folks might call like a Star Trek economy. That's actually how I found out about UBI originally. I was reading an article about the economics of Star Trek because, Picard and Kirk are always talking about we don't have any money, and on Deep Space Nine they've got money. How does that work? They've got gold press platinum. So I found this article about Star Trek, and they said how that basically it was a version of a UBI. Even though that's really interesting and cool, in fact, there's a book called Trekonomics, which I recommend checking out. We're not going to talk about that today. If we can get to a $500 or $1,200 UBI, and people want to take that to the moon and do Star Trek level stuff, that's fine. It's actually really cool, but for the purposes of the video, we're just going to talk about these kind of two core levels of UBI. Next point is, why are we even talking about this? And I think there's two reasons. One, UBI classically has been a program that people have been talking about for quite some time. The closest the US ever got to passing a UBI was actually in 1971 during the Nixon administration. A UBI was actually proposed, and it was closer to, in inflation-adjusted figures, more like $1,800 a month in today's, so it's actually richer than what I'm even talking about as a UBI. And it passed the House twice. It only got struck down in the Senate by 10 votes. So conceptually, there is this notion that you could get to a UBI program in the United States, and politically, we got really close in the past. The reason for doing a UBI back in 1971 was rooted in a couple of things. One of them was there was just this genuine interest in eliminating poverty, and if you give enough people money that gets them out of poverty, then you've eliminated poverty. The other one is this notion, especially in the more conservative circles, that it would be better to build out a social network based on simply giving people cash than to build out a complicated system that involved a lot of government constraints. The idea there is that the more income that the government puts out that's constrained to specific programs, then the more control government's issuing over the individual as a way to react to, communism and all these other fears about the growth of government. The idea was, we'll just simplify all these assistance programs down to, we'll just send people checks. It's kind of weird that this originally started out getting so close under a conservative administration, but it highlights how much American politics have changed over the years. The second reason that we're talking about UBI is, of course, because of AI as the latest incarnation of technological unemployment. We've been through this before many times when other kinds of technology came along, like transitioning from agricultural to more urban is also hooked into these fears about things like the robot or the automation is going to take over. One example of where there is a lot of legitimacy to be concerned about is actually to look at agriculture. If we look at the employment percentage of how many people actually are involved in the labor-related agriculture, it's just fallen off a cliff. That's true both for the world and for the United States. The United States is down to just a roughly 2% number. To a certain extent, if you think about it, if it can happen in agriculture, where you can get to where you just got enough automation to you don't need labor anymore, at least not on the scale and scope, Why can't you do that with other fields? And that's where a lot of the concerns, especially about some of the more dubious economic value jobs, have come up, right? And of course, if you're a software engineer and you see a demo of something like Devon, or if you're somebody who does any physical labor at all and you see the figure robot, especially if the price points can get down to what they're targeting, $50K for a figure robot, and we look at all the billions of dollars going into investments in that space, it's pretty reasonable to feel a little bit worried about what that's going to look like. Things like the NVIDIA CEO saying coding is dead, we don't need software engineers anymore. Yeah, it's a lot. In the interest of time, and also because I've got other videos on the topic, I'm not going to get too deep in on AI and AI robotics in this video, but I will note that it's not that AI and robotics have to take everyone's job. It only have to take 10 or 20% of the jobs away to have a huge impact on the economy. You might be the last software engineer at the company, but if there's another recession or a Great Depression that leads to a revolution, then obviously that's still going to affect you, even if you still have a job. Even if you're doing fine and you think that you're not going to be affected by any of this stuff personally, it is still a concern for a macroeconomic situation. The next question, of course, is just sort of some basic block and tackle about things. One is administration. Here in the United States, the most straightforward way to do this would probably be expand on top of the existing Social Security Administration. If you are of the bent that says that society should have a richer programs, you could see where you'd have a universal Social Security program and then maybe pair that up with something like universal Medicare. And you've got a fairly straightforward basis for administrative systems to deal with those things. In that scenario, aspirationally, it means no more poverty, and it also means that you'd eliminate things like medical bankruptcy. That's the framework, and that also gives you a way to benchmark things like concerns about fraud or other issues. The next really basic question is, does UBI work? And the short answer is that there have been countless examples of test programs for a long time now around UBI, and the general sense is that they have very positive results. And it's kind of interesting because if you believe in capitalism and freedom, then the notion that you then give people money and then they get to make choices about their own outcomes and priorities makes a lot of sense. One family might use that money to get childcare, to then allow somebody to work in the family. You might have somebody who decides to go back to school. Maybe the money gives them the flexibility to move to a different location that also betters their economic outcome. It also gets into fixing some of the problems with incentives around welfare. Once you get onto a welfare program, especially in the United States, then you get blocked into this system where if you do get a job, then you lose your benefits. So then you create this perverse incentive that keeps people on welfare instead of encouraging them to go get work. And that's one of the reasons why UBI got support during the Nixon era from conservatives. Now we get to the really big question, which is how much would it cost? We know how to do it from an administrative standpoint. We have a framework for that. We've got a lot of data pointing to good outcomes. Then, of course, the obvious question is, well, great, but how much is it going to cost? We're just going to assume for the sake of modeling, we're going to kind of keep it simple. We're going to say top level, if it's, call it 330 million people, $500 a month, 12 months a year, that works out to about $1.8 trillion. If that is expanded up to $1,200 a month, then it works out to $4.3 trillion. So those are huge numbers. Every conversation around UBI, at least in the United States, you have to get comfortable with talking about numbers like that. And they're huge. I mean, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, at some point you're talking about real money, right? I think it's important to go ahead and put some of these numbers in context. The total GDP for the country right now is roughly $27.7 trillion. A U.S. government debt level is about $32 trillion. The Social Security program that we have today is $1.1 trillion. The money supply, the total amount of money sloshing around in the system included is about $21 trillion. We spend about $0.9 trillion on military expenditures. And the total cost of medicine in the U.S. right now for all the medical is $4.2 trillion, which is pretty wild. It works out to about $1 in $6 in the United States today goes just to healthcare. Healthcare is particularly interesting to me because the U.S. pays so much more for medical costs. It's about 2.4 times what the average is for other industrialized nations. We actually get to this really crazy scenario where if you switched over to a national universal healthcare system like a lot of these other industrialized nations, you'd actually have enough money to pay for certainly the $500 a month version right out of the gate. You can actually chop down the numbers quite a bit for some of these costs with just some basic things. For example, No double dipping. The average Social Security check right now is about $1,700 a month. If you're on welfare, if you're on unemployment, you don't get to double dip. That might be part of the reconciliation process, is to say, well, we're going to phase out some of these other programs in favor of something like a UBI or a USI. It's really rough. I do think that for the back of the envelope planning on this, you could say that maybe a $500 a month USI would be about $1 trillion, and a $1,200 a month UBI might be around 3.5 effectively. One of the things that's really interesting to me about that is that those numbers would represent big change, but they're not completely insane. Like, it is plausible that you could get certainly the USI level and potentially the UBI level. It highlights the political challenges. They're big figures and they represent a lot of change. So let's come back to some of the political challenges. The first and most obvious one is, what about inflation and how do you pay for it? The most obvious basic way is, if you want to do a USI or a UBI, then you have to put taxes in to balance it out, which would be a revenue neutral model. In a revenue neutral model, if you said every dollar of USI or UBI is going to be paid for with a tax system of some kind, then there's no inflation. The only time it would become inflationary is if you're printing money in order to do this, which gets into another whole set of issues around debt levels and things like that. But let's just talk about taxes for a moment here. One of the models for that might be to say, well, we're going to put more taxes on higher income individuals, so that way you're also not creating this sort of perverse system where you say, well, if you make $400,000 a year, oh, by the way, the government's also going to be sending you checks. The way that we make the tax system represent a more balanced version of taxation is to simply leverage the existing tax system that we have. You might say, okay, well, we're going to bring in this UBI or USI, but we're also going to raise taxes on high income level folks. And this is where this all gets crazy political. What someone thinks is the appropriate tax strategy for the country is a whole topic, and that's part of the challenge around this stuff. There are other models. One example is a national sales tax. You might say, well, we're going to put this money into the system, but we're also going to put taxes, especially on things that aren't food, and so that becomes a way that you balance it out. There's other things like minimum corporate taxes, VAT tax. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting is do you put a tax on debt? Instead of just setting interest rates, imagine if new debt included a small tax on it as a way to kind of drift the economy away from a very debt-centric system to something that's a little bit more encouraging individual level income and expense. And I think that part around central banking is one of the more interesting things. One model for paying for UBI is to fold it in as a responsibility for central banks. Today, central banks are mostly concerned with money supply, and that's in fighting inflation and deflation. Both of those things are bad, which is why they set specific targets. In the US, we have this really awkward situation where the Federal Reserve winds up making statements about interest rates that are already factoring in unemployment as a metric. You get this really awkward situation where the central bank, in order to fight inflation, is already saying things like we need to push unemployment rates higher, which is already getting pretty political about how this stuff's thought about, talked about, and managed. Part of what's really interesting to me about the Fed and interest rates is a sense in which we've been dealing with a deflationary economy for a while. The Fed rates were set to 0% for most of the 2009 to 2022 period. On top of that, the Federal Reserve was also doing other programs where they would actually even take over assets. It's a little bit awkward to have the Federal Reserve advocating for increasing unemployment while also coming in to help out entities with large investments and lots of debt. One of the problems that central banks have, which is that their primary tool for managing the money supply and inflation and deflation, is actually rooted in debt. When rates are low, that benefits primarily folks who have the assets that allow them to take out large loans. That might be one of the things that's really underlying the increase in inequality, because if you have access to cheap money at scale, then you can use that to buy things. Real estate's affected by that. If interest rates are really low, then that drives up the cost of houses, and it kind of becomes this weird disproportionate thing. High interest rates affect certain sectors disproportionately. My family has a background in construction, and everything in construction and real estate lives and dies based on Fed rates. It's wild. That's one of the reasons not to go into construction is you don't want to be exposed to the rates that the Fed bounces up and bounces down every few years as they're trying to manage the economy. The reason that I'm talking about the central banking side of this is that the Federal Reserve is already actively involved in stabilizing the economy and talking about unemployment already. I don't think adding in a USI or a UBI as part of the portfolio that a central bank manages as part of the economy is all that far-fetched. One model might be to say start out with the USI $500 a month level, and then your goal aspirationally is to get to a full UBI level, and then you're also empowering the Federal Reserve with tooling to help pull money out. For example, you might say that there's a Federal Reserve tax basis rate, and that rate is then balanced against the USI and the UBI, and then Congress is the one that then has to allocate that tax burden according to the politics of the situation. In that scenario, then the Fed is effectively the one that's setting the baseline tax rate, and then Congress, they move to a model where the goal is to get to a tax system that balances stuff out. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this to me is that if you move away from using just interest rates to something a little bit more complex, we could prioritize having more interest rate stability in the economy. Historically, for example, mortgage loans that are around the 5 to 6% have been kind of considered more normal. Throw 3% loans or 8% loans. It's just not great for managing an economy, especially when you're also trying to do things like manage housing costs to have those rates change all the time. As I was doing the research for this video, I was looking at how does banking work. This book, Central Banking 101, I highly recommend checking it out. In that book, they talked a little bit about how retail banking deposits, which are the kind of thing like when you or I just put money into the bank, are considered to be pretty stable, as opposed to things like CDOs and other crazy big giant pools of money with debt swinging around. So if one of the side effects of a UBI is that it also increases saving rates, then that in turn might help stabilize the banking system all in all. Now, I just want to say, I'm covering a lot of stuff here, and maybe you're not as familiar with central banking and all that. If that's something that's interesting to you, I'd be happy to do another video about it. The other thing is that, just to note, modeling this stuff is insanely hard because it's all adaptive systems. What I mean by that is there are certain times when you make certain predictions where it's rooted in hard data. For example, if I want to predict how many ninth graders there are going to be next year, if I count up all the eighth graders this year, that's probably a pretty accurate prediction. But once you start having multiple variables and more complexity, and the fact that people will then in turn take different decisions based on what's available, that's part of what makes modeling this stuff out really hard. The next point to cover is UBI, AI, and deflation. When I originally started doing some of the research and thinking about UBI, I thought, hey, maybe what we do is we establish a UBI, and maybe it's $1,000 a month or $1,200 or whatever. And then what we do is then we let deflation happen. Instead of a central bank fighting deflation, we say, okay, well, if AI and computer technology just makes things cheaper and everybody has a UBI, then maybe that deflationary process will make that money naturally work. I came up with two core problems. One of them is that classically when people expect deflation, they stop spending money, and then you run into a situation where the economy can fall apart. The other problem is that debt gets magnified by deflation, and of course we have a lot of debt, both individually and collectively as part of the government. Normally the way that you fight deflation is you just print money. You start with doing stuff like what the Federal Reserve did, which is make interest rates zero, and then maybe do some other asset stuff. It looks really simple. You just issue debt. The problem is that if the debt itself starts to become toxic, now you've got a real problem. And using debt to battle long-term technological unemployment deflation is probably a recipe for disaster. But that's the trick, is that that's the only tool that central banks really have for dealing with economic issues and related to money supply and how it balances out. So in the scenario where AI and robots take over employment, it kind of winds up looking like you either have to do something like UBI, or you wind up having to just issue huge amounts of debt in order to cope with the fact that you're dealing with deflation. In that scenario, you're trying to both issue debt to people who don't have jobs, so then the debt gets picked up by big corporations, which then they use to magnify investing in more automation. If you don't have additional tools, that is how you wind up with a Blade Runner scenario. A few huge companies controlling basically everything. The other option, which is austerity, doesn't really math out terribly well in technological unemployment problem. But if you take an austerity strategy, now you have shrinking budgets and shrinking employment at exactly the same time that the big issue is everybody's out of work. It's very difficult to make that math go. I got a little technical on some of this stuff around central banking and things, and I'm trying to balance out how much depth to go into with what's helpful and useful, but I think it's just good to talk about. The next question, of course, is when is UBI going to actually happen? I think that the key chart to look at for this is probably going to be the total labor participation rates. It's not even the unemployment charts, because as people have noted in comments, unemployment rates are a little tricksy, because if someone's chronically unemployed, if they're employed for an extended period, then they drop off the charts, which isn't necessarily reflecting the true intent that folks have. If we look at this labor participation rate chart, we can see that's actually been pretty stable. Starting in the 1950s, it was around 59%. It peaks at about 67% in 2000, and it actually drops back down to 63% right now, and it actually got just right around 60% during COVID. We're basically almost the same place for labor participation now in 2024 that we were at in the 1950s. It's kind of interesting, a little weird. But it tells me that that 60 to 67% number is kind of the range for a normal post-World War II society. That gives us a basis to kind of think about how things might play out over the next few years. But one scenario is the labor participation rate stays stable, but maybe salaries kind of drop or kind of normalize back down at a lower level. In that scenario, I think it would be really rough to see a USI or a UBI achieving popular support, because what people will do is they'll say, well, you can still go get a job. Maybe it doesn't pay as well. You know, there's a lot of folks who would point out that tech workers making a lot of the salaries they have is a little bit ahistoric and a little bit abnormal. If tech just drifts down to being kind of more like a normal job and other price points start drifting down, but the employment rate stays at kind of the level it is for total labor participation, then I could see where it would get kind of tricky to get the political will to back doing something like a full UBI or USI. But there are a couple of other scenarios, obviously. I couldn't find specifics on labor participation rates to norm it during the Great Depression, but the data that I did find said that typically the Great Depression is about 24% unemployment. If you use some really basic back-of-the-envelope math, that means that you might see the labor participation rate having dropped down from, say, 50% to 40%, or maybe even lower. In a scenario like that, where you start to see unemployment increasing dramatically to the point where it gets way worse, and especially if it's across sectors, it's not just tech, but it's everybody's dealing with it, or a huge percentage of the country is dealing with it, then I could see where something like a USI or UBI gets added to the platform for a candidate, and then it does get the willpower to get through Congress. Remember, in 1971, we got within 10 votes in the Senate of having it pass. If, say, for example, there's a $50,000 AI-powered robot and it just starts wiping out jobs en masse, then the likelihood that that's going to come up in the next presidential election, I think, would get really high. And this is part of where I think it's important to have conversations like this right now, because to a certain extent, this all kind of feels to me a little bit like a break glass in case of an emergency situation. And that's actually why I would personally say that starting out with something like a really small USI today might be very important, so that we have the information and the data where if we get to where we need to do a bigger UBI program in the future, we have the data and infrastructure and planning to be able to do that and make that happen. You could see another interim strategy where maybe a state is getting into enough trouble with their situation where they decide to do a UBI, where they would tie it in directly to things like citizenship and residency. For example, you had to have been citizen of the state with at least 5 or 10 years of residency to be eligible, something like that. And then also adding in some taxes to cover that, and that being a model for how they roll this out. Without going into details, there already are states and municipalities that are looking at doing that. And interestingly enough, we're actually seeing in the US, some of the state level governments already passing bills banning UBI. So it's a very interesting situation, which kind of comes back to the main point around the political support side. If the numbers are, remotely plausible, and we have scenarios where we might want to deploy it, and we're thinking about what the timelines might look, what would it actually be involved in passing it? We can look at the data right now, and we can see that Universal basic income is not supported. It's on the radar for folks, but it's not there yet. One of the scenarios I think would be kind of interesting is something that might look like a grand bargain for reform. For example, let's say we want to do a UBI combined with Medicare for all. Then maybe the bargain is that we also wipe out other programs like traditional welfare and unemployment programs. Maybe you don't need a federal minimum wage because everybody's at least getting poverty level or something similar. Maybe what we're doing is we're encouraging everybody to move to a more gig-oriented economy. Instead of putting so much emphasis on full-time work, we encourage a lot more diversity in how the labor force is composed, where some people might work 10 hours a week, some might work 30, 40, 50, and it kind of just fits in line with them managing their goals. If there was enough social infrastructure that you weren't just simply throwing people to the wolves, which is part of the problem with gig work today, is it's just you work your hours, but you don't get benefits or anything. You can kind of conceive of these different scenarios where things might mix together that would be kind of weird and unusual in the context of traditional discussions about the economy and transition to something else. Part of the issue is that in order to break out of the logjam, you have to get to a crisis point, and that's the part that makes everybody nervous, is that interim gap. How bad is the crisis? And then when do you take action, and what does it look like? Maybe there's a structural point where people hit that wall and then support for something like this grows. I hope this was interesting and useful and gave you some food for thought. It's a huge topic and so much material I didn't have time to touch on. For example, what happens if we go to an extended period where the jobs stay around, but they all just become way lower paying? Like, what happens if a developer job is maybe 2x what a minimum wage job would be, just because otherwise economically you just get the robots to do it? There's also some interesting parallels to me between AI and what classically in economics we describe as the resource curse, which is this phenomenon where a country gets rich because they have oil, except a very small group of folks wind up adopting it. And you get very different outcomes. Saudi Arabia and Norway have very different cultures and different outcomes for how they deal with that stuff. That's an interesting way to build out some modeling for this stuff. I think this is the last point, which is kind of big. I don't think UBI is going to happen in the near future, in the next few years, and certainly not unless we see the economic data start to shake out. The problem is that if you lost your job last week and you're thinking about or dreaming about UBI, it's just not that helpful. You can be a fan of UBI or you could hate it. You can vote appropriately. Maybe if you get really passionate about it, you want to organize around it. But the likelihood that UBI will be putting food on your table in the next year or 2 or 3 is pretty low, I think. It's not something that's going to help you right now. Now, I know some people are going to be instinctually opposed to anything that looks like UBI, and there's a lot of reasons for that, including things like, if we do UBI, people will just sit around and not do anything all day or something like that. To someone who has that sort of default mindset, I have a couple of things that I would ask. One is, just for the sake of scenario planning, how would you deal with long-term technological unemployment, especially if you get to a situation where you just don't use a human for the jobs? Like, you just don't. What would you say to folks? And, I will say, if the answer is, well, then people die, then maybe it's a good thing that you're not in charge. The other one is that given all the range of outcomes that are possible, UBI is consistent with probably the most freedom that still gives the social support framework. And you don't see people returning their social security check saying, hey, it's communism. That's not how people do it. Alaska has their fund dividend where they send people money who live in Alaska. And it's hard to point to Alaska as this hotbed of communism or something, or that people don't work hard in Alaska. There's scale examples of this stuff already. On the flip side, if you're a fan of UBI, I do think it's really important that when you discuss UBI, that you include the economic and political trade-offs that are involved in making it actually happen. My understanding, and I couldn't find the data on it, but my understanding is that Democrats were the ones that voted down the UBI in 1971 in the Senate under Nixon because they felt that the UBI program wasn't rich enough. They wound up saying, hey, well, if we can't get more money, then we won't take it at all. Being thoughtful about not just the idea, but what the details are going to be is important. One of the things I'll note is that political programs tend to be more popular precisely because they're universal. This is one of the weaknesses of a lot of the programs, is when they become very specialized, people don't believe that it's going to ever help them. That's why people more or less, generally speaking, like Social Security, because the idea is as long as you live long enough, you're going to get it. That's what gives it durability. When you're thinking about UBI programs and you want to help folks, the fact that it's universal is huge. I know we covered a lot of material here. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that you stuck through the video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. On my other videos, the comments have been a big part of why I'm doing this, because I just love reading them. Now, of course, this is political in its nature. I can't talk about AI and UBI without at least touching on the political aspects. It doesn't really make sense otherwise. Of course, just like anybody, I don't really want to be in the middle of some political war over this stuff. I'm trying to share my thoughts and help educate and help people out. If you think it's just the worst thing you've ever heard of, okay, that's fine. If you think it's great and we should do it yesterday, I understand that too. With that in mind, like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, all that fun stuff. Leave stuff in the comments. I really appreciate it. Stay civil, and thank you for your time. Take care.